So welcome to the InFocus program. Today's program is on income diversification and household welfare in Sub-Saharan Africa. Our guest today is the distinguished Professor Oliver Morrison, Professor of Development Economics at the University of Nottingham in England. He's also a co-editor of a scholarly journal internationally known as the Journal of Development Studies, and is also a member of the editorial board of the Development Policy Review. He has done a lot of research in Africa, particularly Uganda and Tanzania, on matters of household income diversification and welfare improvements. Professor Morrison, welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's nice to be in Dar es Salaam.
Yes, thank you. Now, a stable and reliable income is a cornerstone of welfare in Africa. The key concern is how the households actually raise their incomes and diversify those incomes. In very simple terms, can you tell us, or the public, describe the concept of income diversification in general and as it relates to the African context?
Right. This simple idea of income diversification, most people are familiar with in one sense or another, which is just the household acquiring more sources, more different sources of income. And that can happen either because more members of the households start working in different types of jobs, or individual members of the household have more than one job. So a typical, what's well known always is in rural areas, it's useful for farmers if they'll often diversify they'll have a farm, but they'll also engage in some off-farm activities. That allows them to, spread risk in their sources of income. If there's a problem with the crop, it can help to have another source of income. Remittances have become an important source of income. So even, having migrants leaving the household can be a source of diversifying the income sources of the household. And in African countries, it's probably more prevalent, partly because the large proportion of the population still live in rural areas, and diversification is more prominent in rural areas. It also happens in urban areas. And also in Africa, it's still the case that extended households are quite common, where there's a number of adults living in the household. Whereas, in European countries, typically it's only the kind of parents and children. And once children reach adult age, historically, they leave that household and set up their own. So you tend to have larger households with more potential workers. And the interesting thing is, as the economy is growing, what activities are people moving into? Are they changing are they acquiring new sources of income? And which ones seem to be the best for how households do?
I think this is very convincing how it's important for policymakers and decision makers in Africa, particularly because the households in rural areas are a very big proportion of the population. But is this concept, how do you see it in the global context beyond Africa?
Well, I think it's interesting because historically, most people would think that if you look at growth in Europe or North America, in the rich countries, in the second half of the last century, so from the 1950s on, it was very much, what people expected is initially the male in the household, the father, would get a secure wage job that he would have for life, that his wages would be increasing gradually, and that was the expectation of people. Some would have a higher wage job than others, but that was what people thought. Then you did start to have one type of diversification, which was female participation. So then it became more common that both partners would be working. They would both have wage jobs, but perhaps sometimes one or other, usually the female, would only have part-time employment. And that was the conventional idea of diversification, except in rural areas. I'm from Republic of Ireland, and I remember that it would not be at all uncommon in the rural areas for people who had a small farm. They might also have a business, they might have a shop or some other type of business. They may also have a wage job, or one of them have. So the diversification, the idea of having a number of sources of income is not unique to developing countries or to Africa, but because households tend to be larger on average in Africa, and because there has been generally slow growth in wage employment, non-agricultural wage employment, then I think that's why diversification is probably more common in Sub-Saharan Africa than in other areas.
In Tanzania, we would like to see ourselves graduating from a least developed country to a middle income country with diversification and preferably with sustained development. Do you see diversification of household incomes in this sense, taking Africa in that path of growth to graduate to a middle income country and to be able to diversify its economy and to be able to attain sustainable development?
I think in that context there are two different types of diversification. One of which you could think of as opportunity-led, that you see opportunities for a member of the household to get a better job. So, you'll have, over time, your children will be more educated. That gives them an opportunity to get into better wage jobs. That's one form of diversification. There'll be more opportunities. People tend to be very entrepreneurial, and they can often see opportunities to set up a household business or something else. So they're adding. That type of diversification tends to increase incomes because people are looking for opportunities. And of course, if the economy is growing, there are more opportunities. So it is very much part of a sustainable development, because it's looking at what's happening to the households. And if there are more opportunities, they will avail of those opportunities and they'll get wealthier or better off. But then you have another type of diversification which is out of need. And that's often what happens with lower income households, or with those who are in casual employment, low wage employment. So there they have to they're diversifying because they just need any other source of income. But it's not necessarily it's part of a household survival strategy, not a household growth strategy. But that also isn't unique to Africa or to developing countries. You're starting to see things like that happening now in developed countries. For example, in the United Kingdom, this old model of, yes, the parents will both have a secure, permanent wage job. For a lot of younger people, that's not the case. A lot of the labor market is much more like African own account workers. They call it the gig economy. If you're driving Ubers or you're working as a delivery person, you are treated as you're self-employed. And it's a very precarious type of employment, and it tends to be low earnings. So often those people will have multiple jobs. sometimes they're not earning enough to get their own house, so they stay in the home household. So in many respects, some richer countries are starting to exhibit features of developing country labour markets. So there is, like many things, there is good diversification, which is following opportunities and availing of them, but there's a less beneficial diversification, which is due to necessity and survival.
Okay, thank you very much. Looking at the landscape of African countries, Sub-Saharan Africa is constituting many countries. Do you see wide variations and differences in the paths and patterns of household income diversification? And in that context, do you see some success stories better than others?
Very few countries, there's very little evidence looking at a lot of African countries at a national level. There's more evidence looking at looking at rural activities and farmers diversifying into off-farm activities. Most of the evidence suggests that is beneficial, but not always. And one example, which is true both in Tanzania and in Uganda, which are two countries that I've looked at with researchers using national level data, is you do see that there has been growth in agricultural wage employment, so which is often casual work in rural areas, and it might be temporary, seasonal. It tends to be low earning. And the households where the members are moving into agricultural wage, or where they're increasing their increased participation in the labour force is for agricultural wage, they tend to be low income, especially if it's females. And that is true in both Tanzania and in Uganda, but it's been more pronounced in Uganda. Tanzania does have an element of a success story, at least compared to Uganda, in that over, roughly speaking, the last 10 years, certainly between about 2008 and 2015, there has been reasonable growth in non-agricultural wage employment. And that is the beneficial, they're the jobs you really want to have in the economy. It's the private sector developing and creating wage jobs. And Tanzania there's been growth in that, and that's more of an opportunity-led, beneficial type of diversification. In Uganda, there's been much less growth in that source of income, even though that's the best to have. In Tanzania, the proportion of households engaged in kind of the informal sector, the own account work, that's remained fairly steady. There hasn't been much growth there. The growth seems to have been primarily in wage employment. Okay. And that is a bit of a success, certainly relative to other countries.
Okay. That's very good. Now, as you see in the growth path, as incomes rise through diversification of household income, move to higher level, do you see the risk of this coming with inequalities, which may be a risk in a society which would like to develop inclusive development?
I don't think there's any specific relationship with inequality. If it's primarily opportunity-led, it's possible that there'd be no real effect on inequality if everybody's benefiting at more or less the same level, then it may not lead to any inequality. What can happen, of course, is that the initially relatively richer households, they have more education, or their children probably get more education, they have more skills, they have more opportunities. they move into better jobs, better paying jobs. And you've still got the poorest households who are left in survival. So there you can have an increase in inequality. So it could be associated with an increase in inequality, but it's not necessarily the case. Really, what that depends on how widely the benefits of economic dynamism are spread. And if everybody can kind of share in it, then you would hope that it could reduce inequality. But it doesn't have a guaranteed effect.
Okay. Do you see a challenge in the trade-off between specialization and diversification? Because we are told way back from Adam Smith days that specialization is the way to increase productivity and incomes. Do you see that at some point there may be a conflict between specialization and acquiring competitiveness through specialization vis-a-vis raising incomes through diversification?
I think in a way it's changing, because the real argument for specialization, that's most appropriate if you're thinking of a firm with a production line. And it becomes very efficient to have certain people specializing on different tasks along that production line. So in your kind of traditional manufacturing industry, that's still appropriate. But the specialization is something that happens in the firm, whereas the income diversification is more about the household. But in a lot of the modern sectors, and often the technology sectors, people say, oh, we don't really want a specialist, we want people who are very flexible, who can think on their feet and do different tasks or do different activities if they need to. So perhaps because of, you have a relative decline in production line manufacturing and an increase in the more services, information technology type activities, and I think that's altered the nature of specialization. I think to be successful as an employee, nowadays they want you to be more flexible. But sometimes that flexibility can also mean your employment is more precarious. It's less guaranteed. So in a way, if you think of it from the household gets few benefits from specializing, because then all of your money depends on one thing. Now, if that thing was a good high-paying job or a businessman where you've got a successful business, that's good, but if something goes wrong, then the house is vulnerable. So having diversified sources of income is always potentially beneficial for a household.
Thank you very much. I think that's very clear. Now, after all this, what would you like to advise policymakers in Africa who are really aspiring to see growth, graduating to higher levels of economies?
My advice for policymakers and those interested in policy is, first of all, to realize that diversifying income sources is a strategy that households use. It is what they try to do. So what you want to facilitate is that they can access good opportunities. And that arises in two ways. One, which is well known, is how can you support the environment for growth of private sector wage employment? Because that is what will generate good jobs, and it will generate dynamism in the economy. And that's well recognized. The other issue, which is I think often neglected, is paying more attention to solving the agricultural problem. Africa does have agricultural potential, and there's a potential to build from the agricultural sector for agro-processing as a manufacturing. But they've never achieved increasing efficiency, increasing production, through to a variety of policy failures, a variety perhaps of unfortunate events, climate shocks, various reasons, but that doesn't mean that it shouldn't still receive a lot of attention. So I think a renewed focus and commitment to agricultural development and agricultural transformation to make it more efficient and productive will be a platform for African growth.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Professor Oliver Morrison. We know you have come a long way from University of Nottingham, so it's in the UK. Thank you very much for coming over to share knowledge, the research results with us, and to be able to share the insights with our policymakers and people interested in policy. Thank you very much. And welcome.
Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you very much.
Bye.